Today, we will use test-driven development to drive the implementation of a queue abstract data type. Hi, I'm Mark Bradley and welcome to Testing All the Things, a screencast where we will use live coding to demonstrate different testing tools and techniques. In today's episode, we will use Uncle Bob's 3 rules of test-driven development. Here they are. 1. Write no production code until you have written a failing test. 2. Do not write more of a test than to make the test fail. At this point, a compilation error is a test failure. 3. Do not write more production code than is enough to make the test pass. At this point, you want to do the simplest thing to make the test pass, even if that includes just hard coding a value. Now let's look at the code. Okay, as I said at the start of the video, we are going to implement a queue abstract data type. To make things more interesting during this implementation, we are going to assume that the PHP array functions do not exist, so that will make things a little bit more difficult to implement. We're also going to assume that when you're inputting a new value into an array, you have to know the index you want to put that value into the array, rather than doing what most PHP developers do, is something along the lines of equals new array, a equals thing. So in PHP, traditionally, normally that would just add the thing element to the next free element of the array. But we're going to pretend today that that doesn't work, and you have to know the index you want to put your thing into. So if we want to put it into the first element of the array, we use 0, and second is 1, and on. So those are our restrictions to make this implementation a little bit more interesting today. So let's see how that goes. Right, we need to think about the first thing we want our queue class to be able to do before we start thinking about the complexities of a queue. We'll start with something simple. So we'll start with seeing if a queue can tell us when it's empty. So let's create a new test method. There we go. So we'll test an empty queue. There we go. Okay. So we'll call a variable empty. New queue. There it is. Okay. And so we've got a variable now with an empty queue. And now we can write our assertion. So we're going to check that the let's use assert true for this one. That empty is empty. There we go. Okay, make that a function. There we are. Okay then. Right. So our IDE is telling us that we've got an error, so that the code won't even run at the moment because we're trying to call this isEmpty function here, which doesn't exist. So let's let our IDE create that for us. There we go. That was simple. Okay. So that's done. Yep, we want it to be public. And we know that we're looking for a Boolean to be returned. So let's be good and tell it that it returns a Boolean. There we go. And now we have to return a Boolean because we've told it does. So to make the code valid code, just make it return false for now. There we go. Okay. And now we can go back to running our test. Okay. So we now have an assertion failure. So we're expecting true, but we're getting false. And that's because of just the default returned value we set up to make the code in our implementation valid. So there's a quick and simple way to make this test pass. It's just changing the hard coding from false to true. Excellent, there we go. So if we run the test now, we should hopefully go green, and we do. Okay, so if you're new to TDD, this kind of hard coding at this point might seem a little odd. However, with our tests on the left here, our tests tell us very little about what our queue should be able to do, but what it does say is if when you call it's empty, then you return true, and that's exactly what we've done here. So the test has told us to write the exact function we have here on the right. And what this suggests is we now need another test to start adding more functionality to our queue class, so let's get on with that. So let's test non-empty queue this time. Okay, so we'll create a new queue, we'll call it 1, so we're going to add one thing to our queue. There we go, and 1 add okay, let's add someone called Dave. Let's pretend we're adding people. For this implementation, we're just going to create a queue of strings rather than actual objects. That'll make it a little bit simpler, but we can pretend we're adding people by using names, so it makes it a little nicer. There we go. Okay, now our IDE is already telling us we've got an error. So following Uncle Bob's rules of stopping once you see some error in code or some failing test to fix that, so we can do that straight away. So let's let our IDE create that method for us that's missing. There we go. Yep, it's a public one. Okay, that looks okay at the moment. I'm not quite sure I like the variable name, so we can rename that. Let's call that person. That looks a bit better. It takes a string, and there we go. That looks lovely. Okay. So we can now go back to writing our test, because our test functionality is we've got some valid code and it's all good, so we can continue. Nothing's going to error if we run the test. Now we can write our assertion, so we should do this. Assert, well, this needs to be false this time, so we'll check for false on 1 is empty. There we go. Okay, lovely. So we can now run our tests and see what we get. Okay, and we have a failure. So we're expecting false, but we're now getting true. So how can we resolve that? Well, we could go and switch this to false, which will make this test pass, but then the earlier test will start failing again. So that's not a great option. So we need another way of keeping track of whether our queue is empty or not. So we could do that maybe with a field. So let's add a new field to our queue class. So private, we'll call it isEmpty, and we'll default it to true. New queue should always be empty, so that's pretty decent. Okay, and now what we can do is, rather than returning a hard-coded true on this line, we can change it to return the isEmpty field value. There we go. Okay, so that makes test number 1 pass, the empty queue test. Now we need to look at how we make the non-empty queue test pass. So what we can do here is we can just flip when you add something, we'll just set the isEmpty to be false. There we go. Okay, right, let's run the test and see how we're looking. Excellent, we're back to green again. Okay, so there's some green tests. So that looks like, at the moment, our isEmpty function is actually complete. So when we've got an empty queue, it returns empty, it answers isEmpty to be true. And when we've got something in our queue, isEmpty answers with false. So that implementation now is complete, so we can probably commit that. That's quite a nice clean thing to do, so let's do that. So let's git and now let's add a nice message. So queue is empty implemented. There we go. Keep it nice and short for today. Simple. Excellent. There we go. Okay. Right. So our code's looking good for the is empty for now. So we can look at the next feature we want to add to our queue class. So we know whether it's empty or not. Let's get a little bit more in depth with the contents. Let's look at the size of our queue. So let's get rid of that line and let's add new test. So here we go. Right, let's start with an empty queue. So we'll do empty queue size. There we go. Okay, so we'll just do a quick copy and paste of this here. Bring that down, save us a few characters. There we go. Right, and now we can start writing our assertion. So this. Right, this time we have to use assert equals. Okay, so the size of an empty queue should be 0. So empty. Okay, there we go. Right, so our IDE is telling us we're going to get an error if we run the tests. It's saying that the size method doesn't exist, so rather than wasting time running the tests, we'll let the IDE fix that for us. It's public, and we know it's going to return an integer, so there we go. Okay, so now we need to return an int, so let's return 0 as a nice default. Okay, and then we can run our test. Okay, so using the 0 as the default there has made our test pass, so there's actually no more code to write. So we'll stop there with that test and we can move on to the next test to see if we need to write any more code. So let's create a new test. Right, so let's check the one queue size, shall we? One queue size, there we go. Okay, right, that's that test. So we'll quickly go and nav these lines again for now. Okay, and now we can write our assertion. So yes, so equals, so our one queue should have a size of 1. So we'll expect 1 when 1 size is called. There we go. Okay, so we created the method in our last test run. So we should run the test again and see where we're at. Okay, insertion failure. There we are. So we're expecting 1 but getting 0. It's quite an easy thing to see there. We are just returning a hard-coded 0. So is there an easier way to fix that? Or what we can do, just as a quick fix, is if we just return the isEmpty function value, field value, there we go, and cast that boolean into an integer. So false will return 0 and true will turn 1. Then that fixes that function quite neatly. Oh, what we got here? Oh, I think hang on, I got that wrong way around. There you go. That's better. Sorry, wrong way around. There we go. So there we go. Sorry. So yes, we need to flip the way around it is. So there we go. My mistake. There we go. Okay, so now we have a passing test. Excellent. Now we can obviously see that the code we've written there is probably not our final implementation of the size functionality at all. So I think at this point we need to add a further test to kind of drive us into writing the correct code now. So let's do that. Save some time with our IDE, write the functions for us. There we go. So let's create a queue of a size of 3 this time. There we go. Okay, so we go, new queue called 3, and we should add 3 elements to it. So add, okay, there we go, 3. So let's add Dave to the front of the queue. He does like a queuing. Add Sally second to the queue, and let's add Bob as our third person in our queue. Okay, so there's the setup of our test. There's the arrangement done. Now we can move on to writing our assertion. So let's do another assert equals. So we're expecting a 3 when 3 size is called. There we go. Okay, nice and simple. Okay, so the code's all good and ready to run. So we'll run our tests. And we have a failure. Okay, so we were expecting 3 and we got 1 because of our current implementation of size. So now we need to have a little bit of a think and see if there's a better way to do this. So I don't think we're going to get away with using the isEmpty anymore. I think we're actually going to have to keep track of the number of times the add method is called. So let's do that. So if we create a new field, let's call it size. We'll default it to 0. An empty set has a size of 0. There we go. And now in the add function, we can also do this size and increment that there. There we go. Okay, lovely. Excellent. And then this implementation gets simplified down to just returning the size. There we go. Right, okay, so let's run that test again. That should work. Okay, there we go. So we now have a secondary piece of functionality added to our queue. So it now can tell us whether it's empty or not, and it can tell us its size. So that's quite neat. So it looks like we should probably commit again. So let's do that. So we'll just add everything and nice message. So we'll do queue size implemented. There we go. Excellent. Okay, there we go. So that's that piece of functionality added. Okay. So when people talk about test-driven development, they talk about the test-driven development cycle, and that's red, or write a failing test, green, where you fix or make that test pass, and then refactor stage. So refactor stage doesn't happen on every iteration round. Sometimes you won't have anything to refactor, but refactoring is basically looking at the code you've written, seeing if there's any tidying you can do to improve the code, improve its readability, maintainability, and things like that. So let's have a look at what we've written in the code first of all, shall we? Wow. I'm not quite sure I like the naming of this add method for those things. You don't really add to a queue, you more join a queue. So let's rename that function to join, shall we? That will make the code a little more readable. So let's call that join instead of add. Okay, there we go. Yes, do the refactor. Excellent, that looks like it's done all the refactoring we expected. We'll run the test to make sure. Yes, there we go. Okay, so let's commit that refactor then. Refactor. So what can we do? Rename, add to join. There we go. There we go. That'll do. There we go. Okay. So there's one little refactor to make the code just a little bit more readable, more easy to understand. It fits with the kind of domain of the queue now, which is nicer. So let's have a look at what else we can do. Okay, well, you can also look at removing things that aren't necessary, and at this point the isEmpty is not really necessary, the field at all. The function is because that's part of the interface, but the field doesn't seem to be necessary. I think we could rewrite the isEmpty functionality to just return that the size is equal to 0. So if we do 0 equals size. Okay, there we go. So that's a nice little change there. Let's have a look at that. Let's run that test. Yep. Okay, so that's all good. So that the logic there hasn't changed the out-facing implementation. So we can now remove the place where we set it to a new value. There we go, and we can remove the field completely as well. There we go. So let's just check we haven't broken anything before we continue. Nope, excellent, everything's working there. So let's commit there again. What are we going to commit? So we're going to say it's another refactor. Removing the is empty field as it can be calculated using the size field. There we go. That's nice. There we go. Right. Excellent. So there's another little refactor done. So that's good. We can go back. Here we go. Right. So refactoring doesn't just have to be your implementation code. You can also refactor your tests. You want to keep your tests just as clean as you want to keep your code. You want your tests to be as readable as possible, because you're probably going to spend more time reading your tests to understand how something should work than reading your code to understand how it is working. So let's have a look here. So we did some copying and pasting when we implemented the size functionality. We copied the empty queue and we copied the one queue. So we could move these to be fields as well. So let's do that. So the empty one first. So yep, empty, and we'll keep it called empty. There we go. Okay, so that was reasonably easy, but it's now still set up. The we've got the field, the instantiation of the queue object still happens inside the test. So this is where we want to use setup methods. So we can do those quite easily. We can override the setup method of the PHPUnit test case class. There we go. So we should leave the parent function to be run first, and then we can just move this line of code here up into the setup like that. Okay. So the setup method gets called before each test is run. So it allows you to put your test class into a state of readiness for a test to be run. So that each time a new test is run, everything's set up and fresh and new again. So there's the empty one done. So we can now just also remove this line and just use the field again. There we go. Okay, so we'll just do a quick test, make sure that did work. Yep, that's working absolutely lovely. Brilliant. Okay, so we can do the same thing now for the one. So let's do that. So move that to be a field. Yep. Okay, and then we can take these two lines and move those up to the setup. Perfect. And then remove these lines here, nice and clean. And here we can remove these lines again and just use the field. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so that's all looking quite neat, nice and tidy. And there's no point yet moving the 3Q because at the moment that's only used once, so there's no repetition, so we'll just leave that sitting where it is for now. We will run the test just to make sure. Excellent, yep, that looks lovely. So all tests are passing, we're all green, so let's commit that refactor as well. So refactor, moving test instances to field and using setup to moving setup. There we go. Setup. There we go. That will do. Perfect. Excellent. There we go. Okay. So our tests are looking nice and neat and small now, and quite easily readable. Basically, we've got 4 pretty nice, simple one-liner tests, and one with a little bit of setup in it, but nice and clean. Okay, so we can move on to the next piece of functionality of our queue. So what do we want to do next? Well, we know the size, we know whether it's empty or not. That's quite useful. We should now probably look at actually kind of handling the people that join our queue and start popping off the queue. So let's start simply. We'll start with a new test. Let's try empty queue pop. Okay, there we go. Okay, so empty already exists, so we don't need to set anything up, but we do need to consider how we want our functionality, how the functionality of pop should react when we pop off an empty queue, because obviously we're asking our queue to return something at this point, but our queue is empty, so it has nothing to return. So there's kind of 2 ways we can do this really. We could return a null and let the calling code handle the null in its own way, or we could throw an exception. So that if we try to pop off an empty queue, an exception's thrown and it's quite clear what's happening. So I think we should be really good, and we should expect an exception to be thrown when someone attempts to pop off an empty queue. So in all our previous tests, we have written the assertion at the end of the test. But when you're asserting that an exception is called, you need to set that up before you run where the exception is going to be thrown, as the test needs to kind of be prepared to handle that throw. So we can just at the top, we can expect an exception. Oh. There we go. To keep things nice and simple today, we'll just use a simple standard exception. There we go. Exception class. There we go. Okay. And I think we should be really good. We'll expect a specific message. So what we got? Expect exception message, and let's say cannot pop an empty queue. That's a nice message. There we go. Okay. Excellent. So now we can start. We can act upon our code under test. So we will do this, the empty set that's already set up for us, and we want to pop. Okay, there we go. Okay, right, so our IDE is telling us that the pop method doesn't exist, so we won't run the test, we'll just let, okay, it can't create this for us. Okay, this is a simple one now. It doesn't know that the empty variable is a queue, unfortunately, so we can just tell the IDE that with a doc block, and that is a queue, and let's make sure it knows that one is a queue as well. That will make our life a little easier. There we go. Okay, so now let's try and create that method. There we go, that time it worked. Okay, yes, it is a public method. Right, okay, so let's run our tests. See what we get. Okie dokie, there we go, we've got an exception. Where are we? So we're expecting that an exception is thrown, but nothing's thrown. Okay, so that's the message we've got. That's all we know we need to do. So we know we need to throw an exception at this point. So let's throw one. So we will throw a new exception. Exception. There we go. Excellent. Okay. And at the moment, our test failure only says that we aren't throwing an exception. So let's make it a throw an exception. It's not saying anything yet about the message, because once PHPUnit hits the first assertion failure, it stops running that test and just errors on that, gives you that message. So let's handle that first. So we'll just make the exception be thrown. Excellent. Hopefully that's a new. It is. There we go. Okay. So it's now failing to check that the message is empty, where it's actually looking for it to say cannot pop from queue. So we'll take the message it expects, and we will set it on our exception. Save, and then we can run the test. Excellent. There we go. So we're back to green again. Lovely. I don't think there's any refactoring we need to do at this point. Tiny amount of code in the pop. Nothing's changed in the functions above, and we were quite happy with those, so we shall move on to our next test. Let's now try to pop off the one queue, shall we? So a new test. Let's see. One queue pop. There we go. Okay. So, right, well this time we expect it to return something because there's something on our one queue. So let's write that assertion. So equals. The first thing on our queue is a person called Dave, so we expect Dave to be returned when this one pop is called. Okay, there we go. That's quite a clear test. What's it complaining about? Void method pop result used. Okay, that's not too much of a problem. We can solve that. It's just saying this function doesn't return anything, but it definitely does. It's going to return a string. There we go. So that fixes that, doesn't it? And then it's an unhandled exception, but well, we can deal with that. So there we go. Let's run the test. So, oh dear. Oh, what a shame. We cannot pop off an empty queue. So let's fix that problem, shall we? Well, we only really want to throw this exception if the queue is actually empty. So we can add a little if $this is empty. There we go. And throw the exception. Lovely. Save. Okay, so that should handle that. Let's run that now. What we got next to solve? Okay, so we must return a string because we've told it returns a string. We've forgotten to do that, so we'll just fix that problem. return or empty string will keep it happy. So there's the quickest amount of code we need to write to solve that. Right, so we're still red though, so let's have a look. So now we've got a message saying we're expecting Dave, but we're getting an empty string. Well, quite an easy fix, isn't it? So we can just return the word. Let's get the case right. Dave, there we go. Okay, and we'll run our test again. Excellent, there we go. Okay, so that test is passing, but I don't think we've hit all of the functionality of popping off the queue now, because we've removed Dave and we get Dave back, which is good. But that's not the only thing that happens when we pop off the queue. We should also expect our queue now to be, well, it should be empty really, shouldn't it? So let's check that this is true. Oh. So true that $this one is empty. There we go. Okay. So let's see. We got a. So we're expecting it to be empty, but it's not empty. That's a shame. Well, we need to make it empty then before we return the value. The easiest way to do that, we can just set the size to 0. There we go, and that will fix that problem. So this size equals 0. There we go. And that should make our test pass. Let's have a look. Yes, it does. There we go. Okay. Well, that's working, but I just still don't think that that's probably the final implementation of the pop method. So I think we need a further test. So let's add another test. Let's test a 3Q pop. There we go. Okay. Right. So we've got a 3Q pop. So we need the 3Q because we're currently writing a test. We don't want to do any refactoring, so we will just do a quick copy and paste for now. And note to come back and maybe refactor that in a second. There we go. Lovely. Okay, so we've got our new queue, and now we can start writing some assertions. So, well, we know the first one will be this. Expect, well, our first one off our queue should still be Dave, so we'll check that. Dave, when 3 is popped. Okay, so let's see if that works. I think that should probably still work, so our hard coding, yep, that's good. So our next bit should be, well, what do we need to do now? Well, we've popped off Dave, so let's check that the size is now correct. That seems like a good check. So there was 3 on the queue. Dave's disappeared, so the queue should be now 2 people. So let's check the size of 3. There we go. Let's have a look. Aha. Oh. So we are getting, we're expecting 2, we're getting 0. That's because when we pop anytime, we just set the size to be 0. Whereas if we decrement that, I think that will give us the functionality we are expecting. So let's do that. Okay, back to green, lovely. Okay, so let's move on to our next test. So we'll do another pop, and our second person in the queue is Sally, so we should expect Sally to be returned at this point. So the pop, save, okay. Oh no, we forgot to add a set equals, that's silly. There we go, that's a bit better. So let's try and run our test. Okay, so we expected Sally, but we actually got Dave. Right. So I think we're done to the point where we can hard code our return values in this. So it looks like we're going to have to start actually keeping track of what is actually in our queue. So this is where we're probably going to need some kind of data structure inside our queue to store that. We will use an array, as I said at the start, so let's create one of those. Private, we'll call it people, and we'll just default it to an empty array on new. There we go. Okay. Now, as I said at the start of the coding part of this video, we are going to assume that we have to know the index that we want to put elements into for an array. So we can use the size for that. So what we can do is something like this. So this people, we can use the size like that equals $person. There we go. Okay. Now that hopefully that will work. So what happens here with this increment with the plus at the end is that the current value of size is returned and then it's incremented, meaning that on the first run of the join function, size is 0, so we add person to space 0, first space of the people array, and then we increment it to 1, ready for the next time through. So that will work neatly and tidily. So that keeps that all working. So join. Or now what we can do is we can look at returning off our array. So let's do that. So this, oh, not that. This people. Right. So we need to be able to track the front of the queue, which is not the size. So I think we're also going to need a new field to track the front of the queue at this point as well. So let's add that. So private, call it front. That kind of makes sense. And the front of the queue at the start is 0. There we go. Okay. So if we use the same trick we used for the add, so we can return this front and increment afterwards. So that will return 0 for the first pop, and 1 for the second, and 2 for the third, and so on. So that should work nicely. So let's save that. Yep, that's saved. And we can run that test. Okay, well, there we go. That's gone green. Lovely. So that implementation works. We can carry on writing these tests. So let's check that the size is now 1. Which I think it should be. Could have written all of these assertions out and then run the test and slowly fix them, but for now we'll just write each assertion. Oh no, what are we getting? Oh, that was me not fix. There we go. See, copying and pasting is very dangerous. There we go. That's better. Okay, right, and we'll check it really works, and we'll do a pop and check we get Bob, and we'll check it's empty. We'll just write both those assertions. So we should get Bob finally, and we should check that it is now fully empty. So we'll assert true that 3 is empty. There we go. Okay. Right. So let's run those tests, see if we're all green. And we are. Okay. Well, that looks pretty nice, and the implementation is, I think, complete there. So we'll commit that. So let's add that. And we'll use there we go. So what was it? So we implemented the pop function. So pop. Okay, and there we go. Excellent. There we are. Right. So that's all done. Our tests kind of show that our queue is working as we expect. Everything's nice, the code is nice and neat and clean, and we're all good. So we can push that into production now. So this has been in production for a little while. Unfortunately, someone's noted a bug where if you join a queue after some people have been popped off, you don't seem to exist on that queue, which is a bad state of affairs. So we've got a bug report that says basically I had a queue and I had 3 people on my queue and I popped 2 off and that worked fine, and I added so one person joined that queue at that point, and then I popped and popped again, and the 3rd person came off fine, but the 4th person I got a null exception, a null error coming back, and so we should investigate that. And the way we investigate that with TDD is we can write a failing test for that case. The bug reports come in. Luckily we've got a nicely well worded bug report, so we can turn that quite simply into a new test to handle that case. So what can we do? Let's call this test pop and join. There we go. So that's the kind of functionality that they were complaining didn't work. So there we go. Okay, right. Oh, we didn't do a refactor in the last one, so we're going to have to copy this. We noted the refactor and totally forgot to do it, so we can do a refactor after this bug fix, can't we, instead? So there we go. So we've got our queue with Bob and Sally there. So we can, so we know that the next 2 pops here work perfectly, so we won't retest anything there, so we'll just do a quick pop and a pop. So pop, that's Dave going, and 3, and a pop again, and that's Sally off the queue. So our queue currently sits where it has a size of 1, and that's Bob. So let's have a look now. Right, so now we need to actually kind of see how this error happens. So we know that when someone else joins, so let's add a join, new person, let's add Mary. There we go. Okay, so Mary's now in the queue. Well, now we can start doing some assertions. So we know that Mary should be on there. So Bob and Mary makes the size of our queue2. So let's just check that the size is still working, shall we? First thing. So this assert $2 $3 size. There we go. Okay, save. Now let's go back to running that test. Okay, right, so it's keeping track of the size nicely, so that's good. But we know when we pop off, so let's just check that, oh, that was a mistake, sorry. Okay, so let's check that Bob disappears nicely. So equals, check that Bob still comes off the queue when we pop. Oh no, sorry, 3 pop. There we go, right. And we can check that the size goes down to 1. Okay, lovely. Oh, no, copy and paste, danger. There we go. So let's check that that still works after we've, yeah. Okay, so that's still working, that's good. But this is where it starts to get interesting, right? This is where the bug report came in, so we should pop off 3 again. We know that was causing a problem, and we can also quickly just check that after we pop off, it reports its emptiness as well. So we are expecting our final person off the queue being Mary. There we go. Okay. So hopefully we're expecting a red here because this is where the bug report came in. Oh, it did. So it looks like the bug report was correct. Oh, look at that. So the return value of pop should be a string, but we've returned a null, which means we're returning the pointer of front is a empty value. Oh, that's a fun one, isn't it? Right. Now let's have a think about this and let's look at the code. This is probably it, isn't it? So here we go. We know that the size when Mary's added was 1. So the size here is 1, but so she's been put into the second space of the array, so she's put in the 1 position, but the front just keeps incrementing, so it expects her to actually be at position at the 4th position, or 3, because we've got a 0 indexed array. So we need to have a think about that. How can we solve that problem? Well, what we can probably do is we can start using the size, or the front and the size together. So we actually should add Mary into the front plus the size. That makes sense. Let's see if that works. So front plus size. So let's just check it for all. Let's just hit the test pass, shall we? Oh, not quite. Cannot pop an empty queue. Oh, what we done? So we forgot to do this, because now that we can do the size increment. There we go. We removed the increment. So let's see if that fixes it, because that broke quite a few weird tests, didn't it? There we go. Oh, there we go. Back to green. Okay. So there we go. So we've got a bug report, and our bug has now been fixed using TDD. Excellent. So we will commit our bug fix. So let's do that. Bug fix handling popping and pop and join error. Go. Excellent. Okay, now I did note it properly this time that we promised a refactor and didn't do it, so let's do that. The 3Q can now become a field, which will make the test a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to read, so let's do that. So yes, on the 3, and we will keep it called 3. So this can now be moved up to our setup. There we go. Let's move it in there. Perfect. Will be really good. And remember that this nice clear labeling, unfortunately. There we go. Okay. So that function now is just a nice simple clean one-liner. That's a nice clean test. Okay, here we go. So if we remove this, and we'll just use, speed ourselves up a bit with a copy and paste, shall we? That one goes to there. Goes to there, and that one goes to there. There we go. And we can do the same now for our bug test. There we go. Yep. Okay, and there. I'm sure I could have probably a way of doing that easier. There we go. Excellent. Right. So we'll do a test run. Excellent. All green again. Okay, cool. So we will let's do a quick commit there. Save. So git add again, and so refactor, moving the 3q to a field, field, and using setup method. There we go. Excellent. There we go. Okay. So we've had no more bug reports, but let's have a look at the code just before we finish. So, well, generally the code looks pretty neat, apart from this bit here. So this is kind of, we know at the moment what we did and why we did it, but a couple of days time we're going to completely forget that. So let's do a little refactor on that, shall we? So we can turn that into a little method with a helpful name. Little private method. We don't want the PHP docs. What do we want to call our method? Let's call it get next queue spot. There we go. Get next spot in queue. In queue. There we go. Or just get next spot. There we go. Nice. That kind of explains exactly what the function's doing. There we go. So that's been created at the bottom. It's a little private int, and the code now is much more readable. So we want to insert the person into the next spot of people. That's much cleaner, and we kind of encapsulated the understanding of that logic of why we do that kind of front add size into the name of the function. So that's a really nice little final refactor. Let's check everything works before we commit. It does. So we can now just do our final commit. So git dot git commit dash m refactor moving logic to select next space in array to a function. There we go. Excellent. There we go. So that is a test-driven implementation of a queue in PHP. The code is nice and clean and neat and tidy. We haven't written a single line of code here on the right hand side of the screen without writing a test to tell us to write that line of code, and that is TDD in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please rate and leave a comment and subscribe. I will be posting more videos as soon as I've got them recorded. If you didn't, please leave me some feedback, because I'd love to try and improve the next video. Thanks for watching. I'm Mark Bradley. You can find me on Twitter @Braddle, or if you just want all things testing, then follow me on @testingallthe.